December 26, 1975. It was the middle of a freezing Soviet winter, but in Moscow, the atmosphere was electric. Cameras rolled, champagne bottles popped, and officials in heavy coats smiled proudly at the runway. The world's first supersonic passenger jet, the Tu-one-forty-four, had just taken off. For the first time in history, civilians were flying faster than the speed of sound, and the Soviets had done it a full month before their Western rivals, the British-French Concorde. To the outside world, this was a victory of socialism over capitalism, proof that the Soviet dream could reach higher, faster, and farther than anyone else. Newspapers declared it a triumph of Soviet science. State television repeated the same message day and night. We beat the West in the race for the skies. But deep inside the intelligence headquarters on Lubyanka Square, there were no celebrations. Among the men who dealt not with planes but with secrets, this early victory smelled of something else, of information they were never supposed to have, because some of the technology that made the Tu-one-forty-four possible looked too familiar, too close to something built in Britain and France. And then came the arrest. March 1977. Outside Paris, French counterintelligence agents detained an engineer named Serge Favier, a quiet man who had worked for the Concorde program. Within hours, he confessed, he had passed a complete set of blueprints to the Soviet Union. Western journalists called him the man who gave the Russians their wings. But inside the Kremlin, alarm bells rang louder than ever. The KGB realized this was not just about one spy. It was about how easily their own networks were being exposed in the West. Within months, Soviet agents began disappearing, one by one, from London, from Rome, from New York. Someone was feeding information to the Americans, a mole buried deep inside the Soviet system. And to find him, the Kremlin launched one of the most secret investigations in Cold War history. It was given a simple name: Operation ISTOK. The source. No one in Moscow yet knew it, but the trail that would lead to the truth started almost 15 years earlier, not in Europe, not in Moscow, but in the heart of New York City, inside a small Kodak photo lab, and with a single roll of film. Summer of 1963. America was changing fast. Color television, rock music, space rockets. But in the world of spies and secrets, something far quieter was happening, hidden behind the walls of laboratories and embassies. That summer, the Kodak company unveiled its newest marvel, the 35mm color film called Kodachrome X. It was brighter, sharper, and richer than anything before. There was only one problem. The developing process was so complex that it could be done only inside the United States. Somewhere in Manhattan, inside a small Kodak photo lab, a Soviet sailor walked in. He handed the clerk a film roll and, in broken English, asked to have it developed. He said it contained photos taken by his friend back home in Moscow. Nothing secret, just memories. The clerk nodded, tagged the order, and placed the film on a metal tray. An hour later, the film was quietly confiscated by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Because in those years, every foreign roll of Kodachrome with a yellow inspection mark was automatically flagged. A small piece of bureaucracy that had become a perfect trap. When the film was finally developed, the photographs looked harmless. Views of the Moscow River, the Lenin Hills, the tall university tower shining in the sun. But at the end of the strip, technicians noticed something strange. A tiny extra frame, no bigger than a fingernail, almost invisible. When magnified, it revealed a short message scratched onto the emulsion. It said, "All is fine, working at the old place." And underneath, a simple signature, Nick. That single word set off a chain of meetings inside FBI headquarters. Agents cross-checked names, flights, embassy lists. They had intercepted the first message from a new Soviet source, someone already working deep inside the enemy's camp. They gave the code name Nick Nike, the winner. For American intelligence, it sounded like victory itself. No one outside the Bureau yet knew who this man was. No one could imagine that behind the code name hid not a polished diplomat or a high-ranking officer, but a quiet, slightly broken photographer named Nikolai Dmitrievich Chernov, a man whose greatest weakness would soon bring down an empire's secrets. Chernov was born in the late 1920s in a modest Soviet town. He survived the Second World War, returned home with nothing but his uniform, and found work as a military photographer. He was good at it, maybe too good. His sharp eye and steady hands earned him a position in the GRU, the Soviet Military Intelligence Service. By the late 1950s, he was stationed in New York, officially as a technical assistant at the Soviet embassy. Unofficially, he was the man who developed film from Soviet agents working all across the United States. Through his hands passed hundreds of secret photographs, blueprints, maps, identities, weapons designs. He didn't see himself as a spy, just a technician doing his job. But there was another side to him, a weakness for alcohol. He drank with colleagues, sometimes in bars, sometimes right inside the embassy's photo lab. He liked to joke, to play cards, to borrow small amounts of money and forget to return them. In another life, that would have been harmless. But in New York in the early 1960s, even a small mistake could make you vulnerable. One day, Chernov was sent to buy construction materials for minor embassy repairs. He made a deal with the store owner, a small discount, $60 saved, quietly pocketed. It was the kind of petty trick that millions of people have tried, thinking no one would notice. But the FBI noticed everything. A few weeks later, he returned to the same store. Two men were waiting. They showed him the receipt with his signature and the store's records. Then, one of them opened a brown folder and pulled out several photographs. Chernov, sitting in a dimly lit nightclub, a dancer on his lap, smiling clumsily. The men introduced themselves calmly. Agents of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They didn't need to threaten him. They only said one sentence. Moscow would not forgive this. Chernov froze. He understood perfectly. A scandal like this would end his career, maybe his freedom. Within days, the FBI made him an offer, quiet cooperation in exchange for silence. All he had to do was provide small pieces of information from the embassy, nothing dangerous, nothing too secret. They promised he would remain safe, invisible, and he agreed. That is how it began. One small act of weakness, one roll of film, one man's fear. He met his handlers in diners, sometimes in hotel lobbies, always under the sound of New York traffic. He received simple instructions. Note the titles of documents, the serial numbers, the markings, the classification labels. He didn't have to steal the content, only to photograph the covers. With that, the FBI could trace exactly which Soviet agents were operating, where, and through whom. Each click of Chernov's camera meant a life somewhere in danger. A spy in London, an informant in Paris, a double agent in Washington, and each time he pressed the shutter, he told himself it didn't matter, that he was only taking pictures. He didn't do it for money, not really. When the Americans asked what he wanted for his service, he did some math in his head. He said, 10,000 rubles, enough for one bottle of vodka a day. The agents wrote it down, smiled, and handed him an envelope. They knew they had found the perfect mole, cheap, frightened, and completely dependent. What Chernov didn't know was that with every frame he delivered, the circle of suspicion inside Moscow was tightening. His actions would soon trigger one of the largest internal hunts in Soviet history. But for now, in 1963, he felt untouchable. He had fooled his superiors, pleased his American friends, and numbed his fear with drink. In his mind, he was safe. In reality, the first domino had just fallen. By the mid-1960s, Nikolai Chernov had become a quiet ghost inside the Soviet mission in New York. He arrived at the embassy each morning, a little pale from the night before, smelling faintly of cheap liquor and photographic chemicals. His colleagues tolerated him. He was not dangerous, not political, just another technician who knew his lenses, his light meters, his chemicals. He was good at his craft, too good perhaps. Every day, rolls of undeveloped film arrived from Soviet friends across the country, agents, couriers, diplomats, and passed through his steady hands. Blueprints of American radar systems, photographs of missile silos, pages of microfilm with coordinates and ciphers. He processed them all, and sometimes, quietly, he made an extra copy. It began innocently. He told himself it was for practice, for quality control. But soon, those extra copies found their way into small envelopes that changed hands in cafes and train stations. The FBI didn't need to push him. They just needed to keep him comfortable and drunk enough not to think too much. He was never a James Bond. He was never a man of ideology or purpose. He was a man of habit and weakness. He drank because it made him forget. Forget that he was betraying the country that had raised him. Forget that every new photograph he handed over meant another Soviet agent, somewhere, would vanish into an American interrogation room. In the beginning, the information was small, fragments, hints, marginal notes. But as the FBI realized what he could access, the requests grew bolder. They wanted titles of documents, serial numbers, year of printing, distribution lists. Each page, in the Soviet system, was numbered and traceable. By knowing which numbered copy had been photographed, American counterintelligence could identify exactly which Soviet officer had handled it. It was elegant, simple, and devastating. Inside the GRU, confusion turned to panic. By the late 1960s, Soviet networks across the West were collapsing. Agents disappeared in London, Berlin, Rome, Washington. Entire operations went silent. Moscow suspected everything: broken codes, double agents, sabotage. No one imagined that the problem was not in the field, but in the darkroom of a quiet man with shaking hands and a hangover. Chernov's life outside work was falling apart. His wife, exhausted by his drinking, began collecting his pay herself. Each morning, she would meet him at the embassy gate, take his envelope of rubles, and hand him $1 for lunch. The rest she locked at home. He laughed it off at first, but soon, humiliation turned into anger. He started drinking the technical alcohol used for cleaning lenses, pure and deadly. At night, his apartment filled with the bitter smell of ethanol and chemical fixer. His colleagues grew wary of him. He was erratic, clumsy, and too talkative. Then came the final mistake. One evening, after the embassy closed, Chernov and a few co-workers decided to celebrate a colleague's birthday, inside the photo lab. They opened a bottle, then another. Someone knocked over a lamp. The chemicals ignited. By morning, the lab smelled of burnt film and shame. The next day, a report went straight to Moscow. Within weeks, Chernov was dismissed and sent back to the Soviet Union. In 1968, he stood once again in Moscow, unemployed, middle-aged, and bitter. For a while, he thought it was over, that his American adventure had ended quietly. But fate wasn't done with him. He soon found work again, this time not in the military, but in the International Department of the Central Committee of the Communist Party, the beating heart of Soviet foreign policy. It was a miracle for a man with his reputation. The department handled secret contacts with foreign communist parties, liberation movements, and friendly organizations from Africa, Asia, and Latin America. It also prepared fake identities and travel papers for agents of the GRU and the KGB, men who would cross borders under false names. And now, the man developing their photographs, stamps, and documents was the same drunk technician who once worked for the FBI. Inside those walls, Chernov's access was even greater than before. He could see everything: forged passports, cover names, diplomatic routes, coded correspondence. If the Americans had dreamed of an ideal source, they could not have invented a better one. And indeed, they hadn't forgotten him. In 1972, the perfect opportunity arrived. A cultural exchange program between Moscow and New York required a photographer to accompany a Soviet delegation. Chernov's name appeared on the list. No one in the party realized his past connections. For the FBI, it was like a ghost returning from the dead. When he landed in New York, they were ready. He carried a small suitcase filled with film, negatives, and carefully folded papers. 9 years of stolen secrets. During one of his first nights in the city, he met his old contact, the same man who had once shown him the nightclub photos. This time, there were no threats, no bargaining. Chernov simply handed over his materials for what he called 30,000 rubles. For the Americans, it was pocket change. For the Soviets, it was another disaster they wouldn't discover for years. After returning to Moscow, Chernov's life spiraled into chaos. He drank even more, lost his position again, and spent his days wandering between small photography jobs and long hours at home. He became paranoid, convinced that both the KGB and the CIA were watching him. He told neighbors that strangers followed him on the street, that his phone clicked at night. He was no longer a spy, not even a traitor, just a broken man living with ghosts. In 1973, he met an old colleague by chance in a cafe. That night, his nerves finally broke. He ran home, locked the door, and burned everything he still had: films, notebooks, letters. Only one thing he couldn't bring himself to destroy: the small English-Russian dictionary the Americans had once given him. He didn't know that 2 of its pages were soaked in invisible ink. For nearly 2 decades, that dictionary would sit on a shelf, untouched, its secret waiting in silence, until the day the KGB came knocking again. By the late 1970s, the Soviet intelligence community was bleeding. Their agents were vanishing across the globe, arrested in Europe, expelled from Asia, exposed in the United States. The pattern was unmistakable. Someone inside the system was feeding the enemy a steady stream of secrets. Each month brought another disaster, another burned network, another name on the silent list of lost operatives. At first, the KGB suspected technical leaks, broken codes, intercepted radio messages, careless diplomats. But the numbers didn't add up. By 1979, at least several dozen agents had been compromised. Too many to be coincidence. Too organized to be luck. Someone was giving the Americans precise personal information: names, addresses, contact methods, even code names used in internal GRU files. It could only mean one thing: a mole. In early 1980, the Kremlin approved a top-secret joint task force, the first of its kind, uniting the KGB's counterintelligence division and the GRU's own internal security. The project was called Operation ISTOK. The source. Its mission was clear: find the traitor, expose the channel, and seal the wound, whatever the cost. For the first time, the GRU opened its archives to outsiders. To the men of the KGB, it was like walking into a labyrinth. Thousands of folders, each stamped top secret, filled with years of correspondence between Moscow and its foreign residencies. Encrypted cables, microfilms, contact logs, financial ledgers, surveillance reports. A river of data flowing through narrow corridors of secrecy. It took teams of analysts months just to catalog it. The KGB investigators quickly realized the scale of the betrayal. Someone had photographed roughly 4,000 frames of operational material: field reports, code sheets, cipher keys, personnel files. 4,000 frames. 4,000 windows into the most guarded heart of Soviet espionage. Every single frame meant a human life on the line. If even a fraction of those reached the CIA or the FBI, the cost would be catastrophic. Colonel Ivan Kharkov, one of the lead investigators, later recalled, "We knew we were not hunting a man anymore. We were hunting a shadow that had already changed history." The investigation moved slowly, methodically. They examined every officer who had ever touched those files. More than 100 people. Every name was checked, every travel record reviewed, every family member discreetly questioned. Some were quietly retired, others reassigned. But still, the leak continued. Then, in late 1981, they got their first real lead. Signals intelligence picked up an unusual pattern in American communication intercepts, references to Soviet photographic sources. That single phrase sent shockwaves through the task force. A photographic source. Someone who had access not to words, but to images. Someone inside a photo lab. When the dust settled, the list of potential suspects had narrowed to just 11 names. Each one was a trained GRU technician or archivist who had handled classified photographs between 1958 and 1972. One name on that list caught Kharkov's attention: Nikolai Dmitrievich Chernov, a technician once stationed in New York, dismissed for alcoholism, no longer in service. On paper, a man who should have been irrelevant, and yet his past fit the profile too well. Kharkov dug deeper. He discovered that after leaving the GRU, Chernov had joined the International Department of the Central Committee, a place where loyalty was supposed to be unquestionable. But that department also kept some of the most sensitive archives in the country. If someone wanted to steal information about foreign contacts or agent covers, this was the perfect place. The team requested access to Chernov's personnel file, but the party's administration refused. The KGB had no authority to investigate the Central Committee's employees. It was as if a wall had been built right in front of them. Still, Kharkov persisted. He reached out through informal channels, called in favors, arranged quiet meetings. And finally, one night, an envelope appeared on his desk. Inside were copies of Chernov's travel records. The discovery stunned everyone. In 1972, while officially working as a technical consultant, Chernov had traveled to the United States with a Soviet cultural delegation. No one had ever questioned the trip. But now, in the context of the investigation, it looked different. Very different. The timing matched perfectly with the American intelligence reports about new photographic materials arriving in Washington that same year. The coincidence was too exact to ignore. Kharkov's team compiled a detailed report and prepared to move in. But before they could act, they were told to stop. Their superior summoned them and said quietly, "Forget Chernov. We've already found the traitor." The name he gave was General Dmitry Polyakov, a decorated GRU officer, one of the most respected men in Soviet intelligence, a veteran of the Great Patriotic War. He had served as resident in both Burma and India, and even as deputy resident in the United States. Now, he was accused of being a double agent. For a moment, it seemed like Operation ISTOK had reached its end. Polyakov was interrogated for months. He confessed to working with the Americans, to a point. But during one of his final sessions, he looked his interrogators in the eyes and said something that changed everything. "Do what you want with me," he said, "but you still have another mole, and he is closer than you think." At first, no one believed him. They assumed it was a trick, an attempt to confuse the investigators, to buy himself time. But Colonel Kharkov couldn't shake the feeling that Polyakov might be telling the truth. One of the names Polyakov mentioned during interrogation matched a name from the original shortlist: Chernov. A quiet man, forgotten by everyone. When Kharkov reopened the file, he saw it differently this time. The timelines matched. The photographic background matched. Even the American intercepts hinted at someone with technical skills rather than diplomatic access. And if Polyakov's claim was true, the real traitor was still out there, living freely, maybe even retired, with decades of secrets buried in his memory. For the next several years, Chernov's name remained a quiet whisper inside the walls of Lubyanka. His case was never officially closed, never officially opened. But by 1990, when new evidence resurfaced, that whisper would finally become a name on an arrest warrant. Spring 1990. A cold wind still lingered over Moscow when three men stepped out of a black Volga and walked up the narrow path to a small wooden dacha. Inside, a gray-haired man was trimming an apple tree. He looked up, recognized the uniforms, and didn't resist. His name was Nikolai Dmitrievich Chernov, once a technician, once a spy, and now, finally, a suspect. For nearly 2 decades, his name had sat buried in old reports and forgotten folders. But Operation ISTOK had never truly ended. And now, after years of silence, investigators had returned to close the file. When they questioned him, he didn't deny a thing. He spoke calmly, almost with relief, as if he had been waiting all these years for someone to finally come. He told them everything, about the small theft in New York, the blackmail, the strip club photographs, the man who called himself Stranger, and the tiny envelopes of film he had passed to the FBI. He even remembered the exact words of his first handler. "Just take pictures of the titles," they had told him. "Leave the rest to us." He said he had betrayed his country not out of hatred, but out of fear. Fear of exposure, fear of humiliation, and then, habit. It had become a routine, something he couldn't stop. And yes, he admitted, he had asked for payment, not in ideology or privilege, but in money, enough to buy a bottle of vodka each day. The investigators listened in silence. When he was done, one of them asked, "Do you have any evidence left? Anything at all?" Chernov shook his head. He said he had burned everything, the negatives, the notes, the correspondence. Everything except one small souvenir, an English-Russian dictionary given to him by his American friends. He said it had sentimental value. He had even given it away years ago to an old colleague, just as a gift. At first, they didn't pay much attention. But days later, as they searched his home again, one officer remembered the remark. A dictionary. A gift from the Americans. Sometimes, the smallest detail opens the largest door. They found the man who had received it. He still kept it, on a dusty bookshelf in his apartment, untouched for years. When the investigators asked about it, he shrugged and said, "Of course I remember. Nikolai gave it to me. Why?" Then he pointed to the shelf and handed it over. The dictionary looked perfectly ordinary. Worn cover, yellowed pages, a faint smell of dust and ink. But the forensic experts at the KGB laboratory noticed something strange. Two of the middle pages felt thicker than the rest, as if a thin layer of film had been glued inside. Under ultraviolet light, they glowed faintly blue. It wasn't glue, it was chemical. They tested the pages with various reagents, and the invisible words appeared, line by line, glowing softly under the lamp. It was the same kind of spy ink developed by the FBI during the early Cold War, a formula designed to remain active for decades. Even after nearly 25 years, it still worked. The hidden writing, invisible to the naked eye, could be revealed only by a specific mixture of alcohol and copper nitrate, the exact same reagent formula that Chernov had never learned to use properly. He had once tried, back in New York. He had cut a small strip from one of the pages, sprinkled it with random chemicals from his lab, and, when nothing appeared, decided it was useless. Frustrated, he had given the book away. Now that same book was the piece of evidence that would seal his fate. The discovery electrified the investigation. For the first time, they had something tangible, physical proof that connected Chernov to his American handlers. It was no longer a confession against a void. It was fact. Chemical, undeniable, and damning. Still, even with the evidence, the timing was strange. The Soviet Union was collapsing. The world outside was changing faster than anyone could understand. Inside the Lubyanka, even the men who had devoted their lives to secrecy and loyalty now questioned what their service meant. And as the country crumbled, justice began to shift shape. Chernov's trial took place in August of 1991, the same week that tanks rolled into Moscow during the failed coup attempt against Mikhail Gorbachev. While the streets filled with protesters, soldiers, and the sound of uncertainty, inside a quiet courtroom, the last great spy of the Cold War faced his verdict. He did not deny his guilt. He said only that he had never intended to harm anyone, that he had simply been a weak man in a strong world. The judges listened, nodded, and read the sentence: 7 years in prison for high treason. It was almost merciful. In another time, he would have been shot without hesitation. But this was no longer Stalin's Russia. It was Yeltsin's Russia, a state that was trying to turn the page. And just 5 months later, Boris Nikolaevich Yeltsin, the new president of the Russian Federation, signed an order pardoning 10 individuals convicted of treason. Among them was Nikolai Dmitrievich Chernov. He had spent less than half a year behind bars. The man who had sold out his country for a bottle of vodka a day walked free, labeled not as a traitor, but as a prisoner of conscience. History, it seemed, had chosen irony over justice. After his release, Chernov returned to his dacha. He spent his last years quietly, tending to his garden, speaking little, and drinking in silence. Neighbors said he often sat outside at dusk, staring at the horizon, whispering to himself in English words he still remembered, perhaps echoes of the life he had once lived in New York. He died a free man in a country that no longer existed. The Soviet Union was gone, and with it, the last embers of a war fought in shadows. But somewhere, in a secure archive, the old dictionary still rests, its pages faintly blue under the ultraviolet light, a silent witness to the fragile line between loyalty and betrayal. The Cold War did not end with a gunshot. It ended quietly, with the shuffle of papers, the closing of briefcases, and the fall of an empire that had ruled half the world for nearly 70 years. When the Soviet Union dissolved, the spies who had once carried the weight of two ideologies simply vanished into history, their names erased, their secrets buried. Among them was Nikolai Dmitrievich Chernov, a man no one had heard of, yet whose small acts of weakness changed the fate of many. He never fit the image of a master spy. He was not brilliant, not ruthless, not even ambitious. He was an ordinary man, swallowed by extraordinary times. A man who wanted comfort, who feared disgrace, and who made one choice that he could never undo. In the archives of both Moscow and Washington, his name remains a footnote, an entry in a file, a forgotten paragraph in a report marked declassified. But the damage he caused was not forgotten. Each of those 4,000 frames he sold represented a life, a person who trusted the system they served and disappeared because of it. Some were arrested, some were executed, some simply vanished, erased from their own country's memories. All of it began with one frightened man in a darkroom in New York, turning on a light at the wrong moment. When investigators from Operation ISTOK finally closed their file, they wrote a single line on the last page. Subject, neutralized. Source, identified. No hatred, no satisfaction, just procedure. Even justice, by that time, had lost its meaning. After his release, Chernov never spoke publicly. He gave no interviews, left no memoirs, and never explained why he had done what he did. Perhaps he himself didn't know anymore. He lived quietly at his dacha, among apple trees and silence, occasionally visited by former colleagues who brought him news of a country that no longer existed. To them, he seemed fragile, almost kind, the image of an old man carrying too many ghosts. He died sometime in the early 1990s. There was no obituary, no grave known to the public. His death passed unnoticed, like the flicker of a dying projector. But the shadow he left behind never fully disappeared. Because in the end, the story of Nikolai Chernov is not about espionage or ideology. It is about the thin line that separates loyalty from fear, duty from survival, courage from weakness. It is about how great empires can crumble not from invasion or revolution, but from the quiet surrender of one man who could not bear the weight of his own conscience. And somewhere, deep in an archive, under cold fluorescent light, lies that small English-Russian dictionary, its 2 secret pages still faintly glowing under ultraviolet, a relic of another world, a whisper from the time when silence was deadlier than war, and the smallest betrayal could change the course of history.